I was only going to make one video this month, but then I decided instead that you guys deserve two videos because there really were two sides to this project. It just started as a bookbinding project and then escalated very quickly into an essay rant thing about how you should go about bookbinding fanfiction. So I ended up mostly just talking in the last video at y'all, and instead of, doing that in this video, I'm gonna give you legit instructions on how I bound the books. I wanted to also have a separate video where all my sources for bookbinding were, because I have bound books in the past. I'm not an expert or anything, but I'm familiar with the process. But this was my first time trying traditional leather binding. So I did a lot of review, and I wanted to make sure I shared those specific sources with y'all as well. Not much else to say, but to just get at it. So I hope you enjoy, and here is how I bound my copies of Crimson Rivers by Bizarre Stars. I download the fanfic as a PDF and then open it up. My personal preference is to delete all the author's notes and go through using an editing software and make sure that there are no spelling errors or grammar errors. I can then go in and add page numbers to each page, making sure that the page numbers that are odd all sit to the right of the document, and all page numbers that are even sit to the left side of the document pages. Then you're ready to print your work. Using the booklet setting, I print 8 pages at a time. You can make smaller or larger signatures as long as they are divisible by 4. For the last signature of the book, it may be an uneven or non-divisible by 4 number of pages, so you may have to settle for having a few blank pages. I can then print, signature by signature, 8 pages each. I found it easiest to print one signature at a time and check over, making sure all my pages were in the correct order before I moved on to the next. Once they've all been printed and sorted correctly, I can then fold them using in this case a protractor, because I don't own a bone folder, to make sure that the creases have been crispily creased. God, that was like a riddle. Regardless, once they've been creased, I stack them all back up in their correct order, and we can start punching holes for sewing. Making sure to use an odd number of marked holes, I am turning the book on its side and placing a weight on top of it so that I can mark all of my signatures at once, ensuring that they are evenly marked and subsequently evenly punched. Normally you would use a book press to help with this step, but I do not own a book press, so a cutting board and then my book and then a brick stacked on top of that will have to suffice in this case. Once all my signatures have been marked, I can then begin the process for punching the holes. I take each signature and lay it out, keeping the spines aligned as much as possible, and I'm using a hammer and nail here just to punch the holes into my signatures. Traditionally, you would use an awl and, once again, sort of a triangular saddle for the signatures, but I'm making do with what I have. And speaking of making do with what I have, I am using bookboard that I have purchased, but you can also use the recycled backs of notebooks and sketchbooks to create the bookboarded fronts and backs of your book. And that's what I'm doing here, just tracing a template with how large my book is and creating those fronts and backs. The thread I'll be using for stitching this book is a heavyweight quilting thread, as it is the strongest, stoutest thread that I had on hand, while still being small enough to not overpower the work. Then I can take my first signature and take the thread and go in and out of the first 2 holes that I've created. Once that's done, I can then tie it off using a square knot. This is stronger than a double knot, and so I prefer to use it, as this thread will have to carry quite a bit of tension for the book. You'll also notice that I am using plenty of thread for this, and you will need plenty of thread, and I will have to get new thread in just 3 or 4 signatures. This project will use at least half my spool. But once that square knot gets tied off, I can then trim off the excess that has been left over with just a quick snip. And then it's time to start the actual stitching process for this book. It's very repetitive, so once you've got it down, it is super simple to keep going. I take my thread and I go in and out and in and out every other space between the holes, getting a thread put between it, and then I do the same thing down the book again. That way there is a bar of thread between each set of holes. This is so our next signature can be latched on to the first one, and you'll see what I mean in just a second here. Once all the initial threading gets done, we can then begin putting on our second signature, aligning all the holes that were made above each corresponding hole on the previous signature. Where the thread had been coming out, you want to put in and out of the holes on the top signature, and then you want to put the thread under the bars of thread on the previous signature so that it catches on to the first one. I'm probably explaining this poorly. I'm a visual learner. Once you reach the end of the first section, though, you're ready to do the same thing in the opposite direction for the next section. I went ahead and included some diagrams because you just do this over and over again, and it's hard for me to explain, but I swear I'm trying my best. If you do it nice and tight with lots of good tension, then your book might not even need glue. I am still going to glue my book though, as I do want the spine to be nice and strong. To do that, you would normally use a book press, but I do not own a book press, and we are a DIY household, so instead I have brick. Yes, this was not quite heavy enough, so I did end up putting a couple heavy books on top of the brick as well. But once I have it inside of my makeshift press, I can then use a PVA glue, which is a flexible bookbinding glue, to put my spine together. And I'm just making sure to put a pretty thick coating over all the stitching and the signature spines. Then, to get that classic book look with the spine that has the little humps on it, I'm using scrap bits of leather, though cording and even paper can also be used. And I'm just gluing those at intervals along the spine for later. Normally the spine would get its own piece of bookboard, but because this spine is going to have its leather stretched over these little humps, it does not need bookboard. So instead, to add a little extra strength, I'm just taking a canvas cloth and gluing that over my spine as well as the little humps that I've added for a bit of extra strength and flexibility. I find this also really helpful because bookboard does tend to peel up if you leave your projects sitting around for a long time, and the fabric will not do that. And since these books did end up in my backpack and in tote bags and sitting around my room, I definitely needed them to be strong. I have added some resources to traditional methods of cutting your book below, but since I have access to an industrial paper cutter, I just went with that instead. Here, I am adding in my cover pages for the front and back. I should have done this with my signatures, but I forgot, so I'm just gluing them in later. Now we get to start playing with leather. This leather was gifted to me by a friend, so I'm not quite sure how thick it is. If I had to guess, I would say 5 millimeters, but that's just a guess based on foam I've used before, so I'm not sure how accurate that is. I used a template that I created based off my book measurements and then thoroughly wet the leather so that it would be easier to cut. This template lets me have some space off to the sides for folding over later, and it also has a little mark in the center of the spine for later. Now, to achieve that classic old tome look, I'm covering the spine in a flexible PVA glue, and then, taking my still damp leather, I'm lining up the center lines on both the spine and the leather cover piece, and draping it over. Then, using my hands to work the leather, I am stretching and molding it over those little humps that I added earlier with the scrap leather pieces. It's important to work with the wet/damp leather for this because it's going to be kind of flexible and take the shape of those spine pieces. You can already see it kind of doing it here, but I want it to be a little more extreme, so using string, I'm tying it around and getting it as tight as possible with the string that I have. If I tie it too tight, the string snaps. If it's too loose, it won't bend the leather. So I have to be careful about this. But once I've completed tying all my strings, I can let the tome completely dry and then remove the strings, leaving behind a lovely molded leather spine. I cannot tell you how excited I was with these results, as this is my first time leather binding, and I didn't expect it to come out so cool. Next, it's time to take those bookboard pieces we cut out earlier and glue them down within the squares that I had marked down from my template. As I was working with the book, I did find that the color was a bit too light for my liking, so I did end up adding a leather stain on top of it, and I was much happier with this deep brown color that I got. I started initially by putting on the stain with a brush to make sure that I covered all the area, and then to make sure that there were no brush strokes, I went in with a rag and added another layer of stain on top to make sure I got an even wash all across the book, and of course across the spine. Once the stain had dried, I could then begin prepping for folding the book. Over each part of the spine, there's a little notch that needs to be cut, as these parts don't get folded over into the bookboard and instead are folded underneath where the signatures are. Then, taking a wet cloth, I'm saturating the edges of the book where I will be needing to fold over the leather in order to create my edges. I'm using my hands and stretching and folding and molding the leather over the edge of the bookboard, using the dry bookboard as a stiff guide. Then, taking scrap pieces of bookboard and binder clips, I'm clipping the folded leather into place so that it can dry and solidify into its bent shape. This step is then repeated for the short edges of the book, as well as the corners and the little bitty pieces above the spine. For the corners, I made sure to re-wet, re-mold. I am so sorry about the idiots revving their engines outside of my window. I re-wet and re-molded the corners twice because I wanted to get them as clean as possible, and they did still end up quite rounded, but I ended up getting them pretty solid for my first time doing this, so I was happy with it in the end, and quite proud. However, because my corners ended up a bit rounded, I did take some sandpaper to the corners of my pages and just rounded off those a little bit too so that they would match. Then, taking my PVA glue, once again, I'm going in on all those folded leather edges and gluing them down, as well as taking some bits of scrap leather to cover some of the lumpier bits and create a smooth transition from the edge of the book towards the center of the book. Also, so that there would be no odd lumps or bumps underneath my cover pages. I'm trimming down my cover pages so that they won't stick out quite so much and will cover any odd edges left by the dubious work I did on the leather cover. Those are then glued down into place, and this also solidifies the cover pages since I forgot to stitch them in with the signatures. Gluing them down like this will keep them in place. Then, above the spine, I can take that little wetted area, and I can glue and fold it over in towards itself, and binder clip that into place. My original plan for this book didn't include end bands, but I didn't think it looked right without them, so to sort of fake that look, I'm taking a velvet ribbon folded in half, and gluing and poking it into the space between the spine and the signatures. Normally the end bands would be added before the cover is put on at all, and I've definitely linked some resources to it below to do traditional end bands, but this was a bit of a last minute effort because I just wanted that look of an end band and not a real end band. For the gilding on the front, I am using a pen and ink to experiment and draw out some designs, and then transfer those designs onto a heat transfer gold foil. This is gold foil with glue on the back that, when heated, transfers onto various materials, including leather. I also have some gold foils made up to put on the spines as well. To prep the book for gold foil, I'm just taking a damp rag and lightly going over the cover, not wetting it entirely, but making it a little more receptive to the heat and the foiling, and then using a foiling pen, I'm going over the gold foil. There are other traditional methods for gold tooling and foiling for leather books, and I've linked those below, but I went with a slightly more modern approach because I already had access to the materials and couldn't convince myself to spend the money on new leather tools. Once I finished with the foiling process, I did end up going back over my gold work with just a little bit of gold paint and pigment because it didn't quite have that lustery shine that I wanted. But once this step was completed, the books are finished. I am so unbelievably pleased with this. I just I have big, beautiful books now. This is just one of them. But I smile ridiculously every time I see them on my bookshelf now, and I'm so pleased to have finally finished this project. I hope that you enjoyed my explanation of the process, and I hope that you found this video helpful, and if not, then I hope you found the links I've provided helpful. This is one of the few craftier videos that I've done. I'm normally very sewing oriented in my content, but I have been leaning into video essays, research, and also different traditional crafts, so I'm looking forward to possibly doing more of that in the new year. But for now, I think I'm going to finish out this year with a big old ball gown project that you guys will get to see next month. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I am so glad that you took the time to visit my little corner of the internet. If you'd like to find out more about what I do and what I have done, I have a website, I'm on Instagram, TikTok, I have a Patreon if you'd like to join. There's lots of behind the scenes content over there. I update photos of my projects on the Patreon as I make them so that you're getting updates in real time as to how they go. So for the entire past month of my life, my patrons have been getting updates about how the bookbinding process has gone. Other than that, I hope you have a great rest of whenever you're watching this, and bye! Fellas, let's make a quick game. Then I gotta be home for lunch. And it is the fourth. Wrong! Oh my god, can't you pronounce things? Number 1, presentation.